My life has never been normal since I was 8 years old. My name is Emily, but everyone calls me Emmy. I'll never forget the first time I saw a spirit. It felt like a trick of my own mind, a fleeting shadow where there should have been none. But it kept happening. Each encounter grew clearer, more real, until denial was no longer an option. Emmy's voice trembles, each word laden with fear and unresolved tension. Her story begins like a confession, whispered to those willing to listen. She pauses, letting the weight of her experience settle before continuing. What you're about to hear is not just a story. It's my life, my reality. And I can promise you one thing. It's nothing short of terrifying. The screen flickers, casting a shadowed ambience as the story unfolds. Emmy introduces her first chilling memory, an ordinary evening that spiraled into a nightmare. Her small, childhood bedroom, once a place of comfort, became a stage for the unexplainable. She recalls the cold touch of fear crawling up her spine, the way her tiny hands clutched her blanket like it was her only shield. I didn't know it then, she says, but that night was only the beginning. A distant sound creeps into the scene, soft at first, barely audible, like the faint scraping of nails against wood. Emmy's voice lowers, pulling viewers into the suffocating atmosphere of her memories. It was late. My parents were asleep, and the house was silent. At least, it should have been. I heard something that didn't belong. A whisper. My name, spoken so faintly that I thought I imagined it. Emmy. Her voice breaks, the terror of that moment still fresh in her mind. I turned toward the sound, and I saw it, a shadow darker than the night itself, standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. But I felt its eyes watching me. She froze, paralyzed by fear, her childlike reasoning unable to process what she was seeing. I wanted to scream, she admits, but my voice was gone. I thought maybe if I closed my eyes, it would disappear. So I did, and for a moment I believed it worked. Until I felt the bed shift, like someone was sitting on the edge. Her tone becomes frantic, the memory raw. I opened my eyes, and it was closer. I could see the outline of its face, or what should have been a face. It was hollow, featureless, but somehow smiling. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat there, clutching my blanket, too afraid to move, until the first rays of sunlight crept through my window. And when I told my mother the next day, she said it was just a bad dream. But I knew better, because the next night, it came back. Her story sets the tone for the video, a chilling invitation into the unknown. Emmy's voice steadies as she delivers a final, eerie promise. If you think this is just another ghost story, think again. What happened to me wasn't just a one-time occurrence. It's something I've lived with every day since. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why I can't escape it. Before we dive deeper, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who isn't afraid of the dark. Trust me, they'll thank you later. The story unfolds in the shadowy, unsettling confines of Emmy's grandmother's house, a place she had always avoided, though she couldn't quite explain why. The house, built decades ago, stood at the edge of a dense forest, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of time. The exterior was cloaked in ivy, its windows clouded with years of grime, and the yard was eerily quiet, as if the surrounding world knew to keep its distance. Even as a child, Emmy whispers, I felt like the house was watching me. Its silence wasn't peaceful, it was predatory. Stepping inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and old wood, a combination that made her chest tighten. The walls, once painted in soft pastels, were now a dull, peeling gray, their surfaces marred by faint scratches as if something, or someone, had tried to claw its way out. Every corner felt wrong, she says. It was the kind of place where shadows stretched farther than they should, and even the light seemed hesitant to stay. The heart of the house was the living room, its centerpiece a massive stone fireplace that had long gone cold. The firewood, stacked haphazardly beside it, was damp and covered in cobwebs, as if no one had dared to use it for years. Above the mantel hung a large, crooked mirror with a frame of tarnished silver. Emmy recalls how her gaze would often be drawn to the mirror, though she hated looking at it. I always felt like there was something in there, something waiting for me to look too long. That night, the house was more crowded than usual. Relatives filled the cramped rooms, their laughter and chatter trying, and failing, to push away the unease that seemed to seep from the very walls. Emmy, her mother, and her two younger brothers had settled in the living room, their makeshift bed a collection of mismatched blankets and pillows spread across the floor. It should have felt safe, she says, being surrounded by family. But it didn't. Not in that house. As the evening turned to night, the mood in the house shifted. The conversations died down, replaced by the faint creaks of settling wood and the occasional whistle of wind through the cracks. Emmy lay on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, the faint glow of the screen casting fleeting shadows across her face. "That's when it started," she murmurs, her voice barely audible, as if speaking louder might summon the memory back to life. The first sign was the sound of cats, feral, vicious, and impossibly loud. Their yowls echoed from somewhere outside, a chaotic symphony of anger and pain that sent shivers down her spine. "It didn't sound natural," she explains. "It was too aggressive, too deliberate." She tried to ignore it, burying her face in the glow of her phone, but the noise only grew louder, more invasive, until it felt like it was right outside the window. Then silence. A suffocating, unnatural silence that pressed against her ears like cotton. It was the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every sound, every breath, every heartbeat. And in that silence came the breathing, low, raspy, and disturbingly close. "At first, I thought it was one of my brothers," Emmy says, "but then I realized it wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from the other side of the door." She froze, her fingers gripping the edges of her phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The breathing continued, steady and deliberate, as if whatever was out there wanted her to know it was there. Against every instinct screaming at her to look away, she turned her head toward the door. And that's when she saw them, hands massive, dark, and clawed, sliding into view beneath the narrow gap at the bottom. "They weren't human," she says, her voice trembling. "The fingers were too long, the nails too sharp. And the way they moved, it was like they were feeling for something. Or someone." Her blood ran cold as her eyes locked on the space between the hands. Two glowing red orbs, eyes impossibly bright and filled with malice, stared back at her from the darkness beyond the door. She couldn't scream, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "All I could do was watch," she says, her voice cracking under the weight of the memory. "Watch and pray it didn't find a way inside." It was a house filled with family, yet in that moment, Emmy was utterly alone, alone with something that didn't belong to this world. And that, she concludes, was only the beginning. The first signs of something truly wrong came subtly, like the faint whisper of a storm brewing in the distance. It began with the air itself. It grew heavy, almost tangible, as if invisible hands pressed down on every corner of the room. Emmy's skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, even though everyone else in the house was either asleep or preoccupied. It wasn't just the silence, she recalls. It was the kind of quiet that felt alive, like it was waiting for something to happen. As she lay on the sofa, scrolling through her phone, the faint glow from the screen flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the walls. That was when she noticed it, a sound so faint she almost missed it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere inside the house. It wasn't the creak of old wood or the shifting of the foundation. It was deliberate, purposeful, like someone tapping their fingernails on a surface. Tap, tap, tap. Her heart quickened as she strained to locate the source. "It sounded like it was coming from the mirror," she whispers, her voice barely audible. The mirror above the fireplace seemed darker than usual, its surface reflecting the dim room in strange, distorted angles. Every so often the tapping would pause, only to resume moments later, as if testing her patience. Emmy forced herself to look away, convincing herself it was her imagination. But as the tapping grew louder, more insistent, her fear mounted. "It felt like the mirror wanted me to look at it," she says, but every instinct told me not to. The sound outside returned next, a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the walls. It was faint at first, barely audible over the tapping, but it carried an edge of menace that made the hairs on her arms stand on end. The growl gave way to the sound of scratching, long, jagged strokes against the outside walls. Whatever was out there wasn't just passing by. It was circling, testing the boundaries, searching for a way in. The dogs in the yard erupted into a frenzy, barking and growling at something unseen. They sounded terrified, Emmy says. Not angry, terrified. And then came the breathing. Heavy, labored, and far too close. At first, Emmy thought it was coming from one of her sleeping relatives, but when she held her breath, she realized the sound didn't match anyone's rhythm. It was coming from the door, the same door where she had seen the hands and glowing red eyes the night before. "I told myself not to look," she confesses. "But I couldn't help it. I had to know." Summoning every ounce of courage, she turned her head slowly toward the door. There was nothing at first, just the faint outline of the gap beneath it. But then, as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw them again, those same hands, grotesque and clawed, scratching at the door's edges. This time, the movement was more frantic, more purposeful, as if the thing outside had grown impatient. And then, as her eyes moved upward, she saw it, a face. It was pressed against the tiny crack between the door and the floor, pale and distorted, with eyes that burned a malevolent red. Its mouth opened wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth that seemed too large for its skull. It was smiling at me, she says, her voice trembling. But it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a promise. Emmy bolted upright, her phone falling to the floor with a thud that echoed unnaturally loud in the silent room. She ran to her mother, shaking her awake in a panic. "There's something outside," she whispered, her voice thick with fear. Her mother, groggy and annoyed, glanced toward the door and saw nothing. "Go back to sleep, Emmy," she muttered. But Emmy couldn't. She sat frozen on the makeshift bed, her eyes locked on the door, as the scratching and breathing continued, just faint enough that only she seemed to notice. As the night dragged on, the air grew colder, and the sense of dread intensified. Shadows moved where there was no light, stretching and twisting as if they had a will of their own. The dog's barking stopped suddenly, replaced by an eerie silence that was worse than any sound. And through it all, Emmy felt those eyes, unblinking, watching her, even when she closed her own. "It didn't matter if I looked or not," she says. "It knew I was there." By the time dawn broke, the scratching and breathing had stopped, but the feeling of being watched remained. Emmy stayed awake, her body trembling, her mind racing with questions she didn't want answered. What was it? Why was it there? And most importantly, why did it seem to want her? "That was the night I realized," she concludes, "this wasn't just my imagination. Whatever it was real. And it wasn't going to leave me alone." The tension in Emmy's mind had reached a breaking point. The unsettling events weren't fading into the past like bad dreams. They were escalating, growing more vivid, more intrusive. Every shadow, every sound, felt like a prelude to something catastrophic. She found herself caught in a war between denial and the need to uncover the truth. Her instincts screamed for her to retreat, to ignore the unexplainable and hope it would leave her alone. But deep down, she knew that whatever haunted her wasn't going to stop until she faced it. One particularly cold night, Emmy sat in the living room, her family asleep around her. The house was quiet, but not peacefully so. It was the kind of silence that pressed against her ears, amplifying every creak of the old wooden floors and the faint rustle of the wind outside. She held her phone tightly, pretending to scroll, but her eyes darted toward the door, where she had seen the hands and eyes before. Her pulse quickened at every flicker of movement in her peripheral vision, though each time she looked directly, nothing was there. "It felt like the house itself was daring me to move," she recalls, her voice trembling. That's when the decision confronted her. It started as a subtle whisper at the edge of her thoughts, an urge she couldn't shake. What if you just opened the door? The idea filled her with dread, but also an odd, gnawing curiosity. Was it all in her head? Or was there truly something lurking just beyond the threshold? Her rational mind battled with the overwhelming feeling that she needed to know. "It was like a voice," she says. "Not one I could hear, but one I could feel. It kept telling me, look, see, understand." For the next hour, she sat frozen, staring at the door. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside felt like a sign, pushing her toward a choice. The air grew colder, biting at her skin, and the light from her phone dimmed inexplicably, leaving the room shrouded in near darkness. It was then that she heard it again, the breathing. This time it was louder, heavier, as though something enormous was just on the other side. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she debated her next move. "I knew I should wake my mom," she admits. "But a part of me felt like this was mine to face. Like whatever was out there wasn't just here for anyone. It was here for me." Her legs felt like lead as she stood, each step toward the door echoing louder than the last. She hesitated, her hand hovering inches from the doorknob. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent. "Open it. See me. Face me." The breathing stopped suddenly, replaced by an unbearable silence. Emmy's heart thundered in her chest as she gripped the doorknob, her fingers trembling. The cold metal felt almost alive under her touch, pulsing faintly, as though something on the other side was waiting. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "This is it. Either I face it now, or I live in fear forever." Before she could twist the knob, a loud crash from the kitchen made her jump, breaking the trance. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. The dim light from the hallway flickered, and a shadow moved, long and distorted, stretching unnaturally against the walls. It slithered across the room, disappearing into the far corner, where it seemed to sink into the darkness. Emmy's knees nearly buckled, but she forced herself to stay upright. It wasn't just a shadow, she says. It had weight. It had intent. The distraction gave her the push she needed to step back from the door. She retreated to the makeshift bed where her mother slept, shaking her awake with tears streaming down her face. Her mother, groggy and dismissive, told her to go back to sleep, brushing off her terror as childish imagination. But Emmy couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a choice that spared her from seeing whatever waited outside, but left her with an uneasy truth. It wasn't going to stop. For the rest of the night, she lay in silence, listening to the faint scratching and tapping return to the door. Her curiosity, once so overpowering, was now buried beneath a suffocating layer of fear. I knew then that the door was a test, she whispers. Whatever was out there didn't just want me to see it. It wanted me to invite it in. And I almost did. The memory of that moment lingers with her, a constant reminder of how close she came to crossing a line she couldn't return from. Sometimes, she says, I wonder what would have happened if I had opened that door. But most nights, I'm just grateful I didn't. Her voice trails off, leaving the audience suspended in the same agonizing uncertainty that has haunted her ever since. The house was suffocatingly silent that night, a silence so profound that Emmy could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She hadn't slept since the night she almost opened the door. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the windows kept her on edge. But tonight was different. The air itself felt alive, thick with an oppressive energy that pressed down on her chest and made each breath feel laborious. She knew, without a doubt, that something was about to happen. And this time, there would be no turning away. It started just after midnight. Emmy sat upright on the sofa, clutching a blanket as though it could shield her from the inevitable. The family dogs, usually quiet at this hour, erupted into frantic barking. Their howls carried an urgency that sent chills down her spine. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate, and closer than ever before. It wasn't coming from the door this time. It was coming from the walls. I could hear it moving, she recalls, her voice trembling. Like it was circling me, testing the boundaries of the room. Her eyes darted to the mirror above the fireplace, that old, tarnished relic that always seemed to watch her. The room was dimly lit by the faint glow of a dying lamp, and in the mirror's reflection, the shadows appeared to ripple and shift, though nothing in the room was moving. Emmy's stomach knotted as she felt a cold draft sweep past her, carrying with it a faint whisper, her name. It wasn't just a voice, she says. It felt like fingers brushing against my skin, pulling me toward the mirror. Unable to look away, Emmy's gaze locked onto the glass. At first, she saw only her own reflection, pale and wide-eyed with fear. But then, the image began to distort. The edges of the mirror darkened, as though shadows were bleeding into the frame. Her reflection flickered, and for a moment, she wasn't alone. A figure stood behind her, a tall, gaunt silhouette with hollow eyes and a twisted grin that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. She spun around, heart racing, but the room behind her was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. But I knew it wasn't, she whispers. I could feel it. It was still there, watching me. The dog's barking turned into whimpers, then silence. A heavy thud echoed from the hallway, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, measured, and impossibly heavy. They didn't sound human. Each step reverberated through the house, shaking the walls and sending tremors through the floor. Emmy's body froze, her mind screaming for her to run, but her legs refused to move. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the living room. And then, the door creaked open. Not all the way, just enough to let a sliver of darkness seep into the room. It was an unnatural darkness, deeper than the shadows around it, as though the very essence of the void was leaking into her world. Emmy stared at the opening, her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't see anything in the darkness, but she felt it. A presence, a weight, a pair of eyes staring back at her from the abyss. I didn't want to look, she says, but I couldn't stop myself. As her eyes adjusted, the figure emerged, slowly, deliberately. It was the same entity from the mirror, but now it was real, tangible. Its skin was ashen, stretched tightly over jagged bones that jutted out unnaturally. Its hollow eyes burned with a faint, red glow, and its smile was impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. It stood motionless, filling the doorway, its head tilted slightly as though studying her. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the space like heat waves on asphalt. It didn't move, Emmy says, her voice cracking. It just stood there, smiling, like it was waiting for me to do something. The sound of her mother's voice broke the spell. A groggy, irritated call from the other room snapped Emmy out of her trance. She turned her head for just a second, long enough to yell, "Mom, come here." But when she looked back at the door, it was empty. The entity had vanished, leaving behind only the suffocating sense of dread and the faint scent of burnt wood. Emmy's mother stumbled into the room, annoyed and half asleep, asking what all the noise was about. But Emmy couldn't explain. What could she say? That something not of this world had stood in the doorway, staring into her soul? The rest of the night passed in a haze of terror and sleeplessness. Even with her mother sitting beside her, Emmy couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The house felt wrong, heavier somehow, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. I knew it wasn't gone, she says, her voice barely above a whisper. It had shown itself to me, and I had looked. That was all it needed. As dawn finally broke, Emmy felt the weight lift slightly, but the scars of that night would remain. The entity had made its presence known, and she knew in her heart that it wouldn't be the last time. That was the moment I realized, she concludes, there are things in this world, things that shouldn't exist but do. And once they notice you, they never let go. The moment of revelation came as suddenly as a thunderclap, shattering the fragile barrier between reality and the unknown. Emmy had spent days walking on eggshells, avoiding mirrors, and refusing to be left alone in any room of the house. But on this night, something was different. The air felt alive again, charged with an electric tension that seemed to hum just beneath her skin. It was as if the house itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. I knew something was coming, she says, her voice heavy with the weight of the memory. And no matter what I did, I couldn't stop it. It began when the old mirror above the fireplace shattered without warning. The sound exploded through the quiet of the house, a piercing crash that sent shards of glass raining down onto the floor. Everyone else in the house was fast asleep, leaving Emmy alone to face the aftermath. The broken mirror revealed the wall behind it, which was stained with dark, jagged streaks that hadn't been visible before. They looked like claw marks, etched deep into the wood, as though something had been trying to tear its way through. It wasn't random, Emmy whispers. It felt like it was meant for me to see. As she stood frozen, staring at the scratches, the air around her grew colder, unnaturally so. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and a faint, low hum filled the room. It was coming from the wall. Emmy leaned in closer, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of the noise. It wasn't a hum, she realized. It was a voice, muffled, distorted, and distant, as though it were coming from the other side of the wall. And it was calling her name. It didn't sound like a person, she says, trembling. It was deeper, almost hollow, like the voice of something that shouldn't exist. Unable to resist, Emmy reached out and touched the wall. The moment her fingers grazed the surface, the room shifted. The world around her seemed to ripple, the edges of her vision darkening, as if she were being pulled into a tunnel. The voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear. And then, with a deafening roar, the wall gave way, not physically, but in a way that defied explanation. It was as if she had been transported to another place entirely. The room around her was gone, replaced by a vast, empty expanse of darkness. The ground beneath her feet was cold and uneven, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. She wasn't alone. From the shadows emerged the figure she had seen in the mirror, the tall, skeletal entity with hollow eyes and a jagged grin. But now it was joined by others. Figures began to materialize one by one, each more grotesque than the last. Some crawled on all fours, their limbs bending at unnatural angles, while others loomed over her, their distorted faces filled with malevolent glee. They surrounded me, she says, her voice shaking. And they were laughing. Not like people, though. It was a sound that made my skin crawl, like metal scraping against bone. In the center of the gathering, a single figure stepped forward. It was larger than the rest, its presence overwhelming. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its eyes burned brighter than any of the others, a deep, piercing red that seemed to see straight through her. The laughter stopped as it raised a hand, pointing directly at Emmy. The voice that followed was deafening, reverberating through the darkness and into her very bones. "You are the key," it said, the words dragging out like they were being pulled from a great depth. "You will open the door." The realization hit Emmy like a punch to the chest. This wasn't random. She wasn't just being haunted, she was being used. The entity, or whatever it was, needed her for something far more sinister. She tried to speak, to demand answers, but her voice was gone, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the moment. The hooded figure took another step forward, and Emmy felt the ground beneath her begin to give way, as though she were sinking into the darkness itself. Just as she thought she would be consumed, a bright light pierced the shadows, blinding her. The world around her erupted into chaos as the figures recoiled, hissing and shrieking in pain. Emmy felt herself being pulled backward, away from the darkness and back into the safety of her grandmother's living room. She gasped for air, her body trembling violently as she collapsed onto the floor. The mirror was whole again, its surface pristine as if it had never been broken. But the claw marks on the wall remained, a chilling reminder of what she had just experienced. In the days that followed, Emmy pieced together what little she could. The entities weren't merely spirits, they were something older, something darker, and they had marked her for a purpose she didn't fully understand. They wanted me to open the door, she says, her eyes haunted. But I don't know what that means. And I don't think I want to find out. The revelation left her shaken to her core. Whatever connection she had to the supernatural was no accident. It was deliberate, part of a larger plan that she couldn't yet comprehend. And while the figures had retreated for now, she knew they weren't gone. They were waiting, watching, biding their time. That night changed everything, she concludes, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I'll ever be free of them, but one thing is certain. The door they want me to open, it's not meant for this world. As dawn broke and the first rays of sunlight pierced through the windows, Emmy sat on the living room floor, her back pressed against the cold wall. Her entire body trembled, not from the chill, but from the lingering terror of the night's events. Her mind replayed every detail, the broken mirror, the claw marks, the voice that echoed in her soul, calling her the key. Despite the daylight, the house didn't feel safe. In fact, the sunlight seemed to make the shadows even darker, deeper, as though they were hiding something far more insidious. Her mother entered the room, yawning and oblivious to the terror that had unfolded mere hours before. Emmy tried to explain what had happened, her voice breaking as she recounted the shattered mirror and the hooded figure. But her mother's face remained impassive, her concern replaced by dismissive skepticism. It was just a dream, Emmy, she said, her tone firm. You've always had an active imagination. You probably just scared yourself. But Emmy knew it wasn't a dream. The claw marks on the wall remained as proof, deep gouges that no animal or person could have made. She pointed to them, desperate for validation, but her mother only shook her head. That's just wear and tear on an old house, she said, brushing off Emmy's protests. You need to stop letting your imagination run wild. And with that, she left the room, leaving Emmy alone with the creeping realization that she would have to face this terror on her own. For days, the house seemed to hum with an invisible energy, as though it were holding its breath. Emmy's siblings and cousins played in the yard, laughing and carefree, completely unaware of the darkness that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. She tried to join them, to distract herself from the horrors that haunted her, but the feeling of being watched never left. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch toward her, and faint whispers followed her wherever she went. It wasn't just the house anymore, she says. It was everywhere I went. I couldn't escape it. One evening, as she walked through the yard, she noticed something strange. The family dogs, usually playful and energetic, had grown eerily silent. They sat in a circle near the tree line, staring into the dense forest as though transfixed by something unseen. Emmy called out to them, but they didn't move, their eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the trees. A shiver ran down her spine as she approached them, her footsteps hesitant. It felt like they were guarding something, she recalls. Or maybe warning me. That's when she saw it. A faint light flickering deep within the forest, like a lantern swaying in the wind. It wasn't the warm, golden glow of a flame, but a cold, unnatural light that seemed to pulse in time with her racing heartbeat. Against her better judgment, Emmy took a step toward the trees, her curiosity warring with her fear. But as she drew closer, the light vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence of the forest. The dogs began to growl, low and threatening, their eyes still fixed on the same spot. Emmy backed away, her heart pounding, and fled to the safety of the house. That night, she dreamt of the hooded figure. It stood at the edge of her bed, its eyes burning like embers in the darkness. This time, it didn't speak. It simply stared, its jagged grin widening as it raised a hand and pointed toward the door. Emmy woke with a start, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. She knew what it wanted her to open the door. The realization filled her with dread, but also a grim determination. I couldn't let it win, she says. I didn't know what was on the other side of that door, but I knew it wasn't meant to be opened. The next morning, she packed her things and left her grandmother's house, vowing never to return. But the darkness followed her. In her own home, miles away from the forest, the whispers persisted. The mirrors seemed to ripple when she passed, and faint claw marks began to appear on the walls. It became clear that this wasn't about the house, it was about her. They marked me, she says. I don't know why, but I can feel it. Wherever I go, they'll find me. Though she managed to build a semblance of normalcy in her life, the experiences left her scarred, both physically and emotionally. She avoids mirrors, refuses to sleep near doors, and keeps every light in her house on at night. But even with these precautions, she knows the entities are never far away. They're patient, she says. They don't need to rush. They know I'll have to face them eventually. The story ends with Emmy sitting in her dimly lit living room, her eyes darting toward the shadows that seem to stretch unnaturally long. Her voice drops to a whisper as she delivers her final words. If you ever feel like you're being watched, like the shadows are just a little too dark, trust your instincts. Because sometimes they're not just shadows, and sometimes they're waiting for you to open the door. Even though Emmy left her grandmother's house behind, she never truly escaped. The entities, the voices, the shadowy presence, they had become a part of her life. At first, she thought distance would be enough to sever the connection, that moving miles away would allow her to rebuild some semblance of normalcy. But she quickly learned the terrifying truth. They weren't tied to the house. They were tied to her. No matter where I go, I feel them, she says, her voice trembling. In the shadows, in the silence. They're always there. The signs were subtle at first. The whispers began again, faint and fleeting, like a breeze brushing past her ears. Lights in her apartment flickered inexplicably, and objects she knew she hadn't touched would appear in different places. The claw marks returned too, appearing on the walls of her bedroom, on her furniture, even on the edges of her mirror. But the worst part was the feeling, the unshakable sensation of being watched. It's like a weight pressing down on you, she explains. You can't see them, but you know they're there, just out of sight. One night, Emmy decided she couldn't live in fear anymore. Armed with salt, candles, and pages printed from online forums about warding off spirits, she attempted a ritual to banish them. She drew a circle in the middle of her living room, surrounded it with salt, and lit the candles, her hands shaking as she recited the words she had found. For a brief moment, the air grew still, and she felt a flicker of hope. But then, the shadows around her seemed to ripple and move, drawn toward the light like moths to a flame. The candles extinguished all at once, plunging her into darkness, and the whispers began again, louder this time, clearer. You cannot escape us, they said in unison, their voices echoing inside her head. We're already here. That night left Emmy shaken to her core. She realized she couldn't fight them, couldn't drive them away. They weren't just haunting her, they were a part of her now, as inseparable as her own shadow. It's not just about fear anymore, she says. It's about survival. They don't just want to scare me. They want something more, something I don't understand yet. Over time, Emmy began to notice patterns in their behavior, as if the entities were trying to communicate something. The claw marks always appeared near doors and windows, and the whispers grew louder whenever she passed by a mirror. One night, while sitting in her dimly lit kitchen, she stared at her reflection in the darkened window and felt a chill run down her spine. Her reflection didn't move with her. Instead, it smiled, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched wider and wider until it was no longer human. She stumbled backward, the chair clattering to the floor, but the reflection remained, its eyes glowing faintly red. They're not just outside anymore, she says. They're inside too. Inside the mirrors, inside my mind. The most unsettling realization came when Emmy began to dream. Every night, the same vision haunted her, a door old and weathered, standing alone in a vast, empty void. On the other side, she could hear the whispers, louder and more frantic with each passing dream. The hooded figure stood beside the door, its burning red eyes fixed on her. You are the key, it would say, its voice reverberating through the void. Open the door. Each time, she woke in a cold sweat, her heart racing, the words echoing in her mind. I don't know what's behind that door, she admits, but I know it's not meant to be opened. Not by me, not by anyone. Despite the terror that surrounds her, Emmy tries to hold on to the remnants of her normal life. She goes to work, spends time with friends, and pretends that everything is fine. But the darkness is always there, lurking just beneath the surface. She avoids mirrors whenever possible, keeps every light in her apartment on, and never lets herself be alone in the dark for too long. It's not a life, she says, her voice heavy with exhaustion. It's survival. But what else can I do? The story ends with Emmy sitting alone in her apartment, the faint glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. Her eyes dart toward the mirror on the wall, where the faint outline of the hooded figure seems to linger, watching her. She takes a deep breath, her hands trembling, and speaks directly to the camera. If you ever feel like the darkness is watching you, don't ignore it. Don't look too closely at the shadows. And for the love of God, never, ever open the door.